Hey everyone, this is an article by Alex Callinicos titled Maoism, Stalinism, and the Soviet Union. This is from Marxist.org. It says it was originally published in International Socialism 2-5, summer 1979. So, here we go. This is a review of Charles Bettelheim's Class Struggles in the USSR, first period 1917 to 1923, and second period 1923 to 1930. So here we go. Charles Bettelheim, I think that's how you say it, Charles Bettelheim, is the most important instance of a widespread phenomenon on the European left today. The past few years have seen an outpouring of analysis and discussion of the, quote, socialist countries from those whose politics, whether orthodox, communist, or Maoist, had previously involved the suppression of the slightest critical tremors. Various factors have contributed to this situation. The evolution of the Eastern Bloc, and in particular the massive struggles which have shaken parts of Eastern Europe, Poland 1970 and 1976, Czechoslovakia 1968, the Romanian miners' strike of 1977, have all had considerable impact. Wikipedia says the Zhui or Yi Jiu Valley miners' strike of 1977 was the largest protest movement against the communist regime in Romania before its final days. It took place from the 1st to the 3rd of August 1977 and was centered in the coal mining town of Lupeni in Transylvania's Zhui Valley. Back to the text. Also, to have considerable impact. So I guess I'll just reread the sentence. Various factors have contributed to this situation: the evolution of the Eastern Bloc, and in particular the massive struggles which have shaken parts of Eastern Europe, Poland 1970 and 1976, Czechoslovakia 1968, the Romanian miners' strike of 1977 have had a considerable impact, as did the split between the Russian and Chinese bureaucracies after 1963. The only attempt to come to terms with this history produced by this crisis, which goes beyond Stalinist apologetics or social democratic liberalism, is Bettelheim's massive study of the USSR. Class Struggles in the USSR invites comparisons with the path-breaking analysis of the Soviet Union by Tony Cliff. Like Cliff, Bettelheim refuses to accept that state ownership of the means of production is the main criterion of the existence of a worker state. Quote, life has made its business to show, or rather to recall, that changes in legal forms of ownership do not suffice to cause the conditions for the existence of classes and for class struggle to disappear. These conditions are rooted, as Marx and Lenin often emphasize, not in legal forms of ownership, but in production relations, that is, the form of the social process of appropriation, in the place that the form of this process assigns to the agents of production. In fact, the relations that are established between them in social production, end quote. Bettelheim thus rejects the approach to the problem of analyzing the, quote, socialist countries typical of both orthodox Stalinist and Trotsky's epigons. Like Cliff, Bettelheim concludes that capitalist relations of production prevail in the USSR, quote, the producers in parenthesis, in the Soviet Union, Alex Callinicos, end parenthesis, are still wage earners working to valorize the means of production, with the latter functioning as collective capital by a state bourgeoisie, end quote. Bettelheim. There, however, the resemblance ends. Bettelheim's aim is to use the Russian case to establish the superiority of the Chinese model of socialism, and in particular to bring out the universal relevance of the Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 67. As we shall see, this leads Bettelheim to champion a form of extreme idealism. New section, quote, Economism and the New Economic Policy. The first volume of Class Struggles in the USSR is devoted to the period between the October Revolution in 1917 and the eve of Lenin's death in January 1924. Bettelheim concentrates on the form taken by the class struggle during those years within the new Soviet state machine and the Bolshevik Party itself. Bettelheim carefully documents the atrophy of the Soviets, the growth of a state bureaucracy largely inherited from Tsarism, the reemergence of the secret police, and within party and state, the concentration of power in the hands of a small group around the Politburo and party secretariat under Stalin. In this way, according to Bettelheim, the conditions for the formation of a new, quote, state bourgeoisie, end quote, were created. The process was facilitated by the prevalence of, quote, economism within the Bolshevik Party. Quote, economism, on this interpretation, involves the, quote, thesis of the primacy of the development of the productive forces, end quote. According to this thesis, it is the development of the productive forces, not the class struggle, which is the motor of historical change. Sometimes people refer to this, from my experience with literature on this subject, as productivism. And I think this is very much the opinion of scholars such as, what the fuck is his name? Stephen A. Smith, the important historian of world communism. He was the editor of the Oxford Handbook of Communism, and also the author of the book Red Petrograd, which is extremely important. As Stalin put it, quote, first the productive forces of society change and develop, and then, depending on these changes and in conformity with these changes, men's relations of production, their economic relations change, end quote. Stalin. On a, quote, economistic, end quote, interpretation of Marxism, the development of a classless communist society would depend solely on economic growth and technological progress. Their, quote, economism led the Bolsheviks, with the exception of Lenin, to underestimate the importance of the ideological and political conditions of the transition to communism, and thus to neglect the emerging, quote, state bourgeoisie, end quote, within the Soviet state apparatus itself. These, quote, economistic, end quote, tendencies were strengthened during the period of, quote, war communism between 1918 and 1921, when the methods of forcible extraction of grain surpluses from the peasantry imposed by the necessities of civil war were identified with the construction of socialism. The new economic policy introduced in 1921, which substituted reliance on the market rather than coercion in the state's relations with the peasantry, was seen as only a temporary tactical retreat. The result was that the Bolsheviks ignored the necessity of transforming the social relations of production. The problem, as the Bolsheviks saw it, was to secure economic growth under state control. The Bolsheviks therefore failed to develop, quote, proletarian social practices, end quote. In their absence, the penetration of party and state bureaucracy by the bourgeoisie continued unabated. The fundamental conditions for the process to occur were whereby the state machinery of the proletarian dictatorship acquired independence, was the predominance of bourgeois or pre-bourgeois social relations and the development on that basis of bourgeois social practices. These practices made possible the reproduction of capitalist relations, end quote. Bettelheim. I don't know where that quote started. I don't know, that's weird. Sorry, there's an apostrophe at the end of that, and I'm like, is that, what the hell is that? I don't know. Sorry. There's a quote somewhere in there, but I don't know where it started. Only Lenin in the last years of his life began to recognize the dangers with which the Soviet state was faced. Reevaluating the new economic policy according to Bettelheim, Lenin abandoned his previous, quote, underestimation, end quote, of the revolutionary role of the peasantry and came to see the alliance between workers and peasants as the basis of the transition to communism. This positive assessment of the new economic policy provides the framework for the second volume of Bettelheim's work, which focuses upon the, quote, Great Change of 1928, when Stalin scrapped the new economic policy and embarked on forced collectivization of the peasantry and rapid industrialization. Bettelheim is concerned to refute the traditional view of 1928, which is that a procurement crisis resulted from the withholding of grain by the kulaks, rich peasants, made the abandonment of NEP and the resort to coercion to secure grain inevitable. Bettelheim argues, drawing heavily on S. Grosskopf's Les Alliances Ouvrières et Paysannes in URSS 1921 to 28. The grain crisis of 1927 to 28 was the result of the gradual abandonment of the NEP by the Soviet regime. I don't see any description for that book just referenced. The main source of the grain sold to the state was not the kulaks, but the middle and poor peasants whose incentive to provide the grain was gradually undermined by the failure of industry to provide them with the equipment they needed to develop their plots. As a side note, I think this is also historically the case. I think it's there was a great exaggeration within the Soviet state and the kind of like the apologetic historians of both Stalinism and Trotsky's paranoia, I would say. Maybe paranoia is not the right word, but excessive concern with the dangers of the so-called right opposition as opposed to Stalin, right? So like Bukharin, was like the worst of the worst, right? And I think Trotsky, until his death, continued to view the Stalinist bureaucracy is a very authoritarian, totalitarian form of centrism that preserved the gains of the workers' state while and simultaneously destroyed the right opposition. So it was simultaneously, maybe he wouldn't have agreed to the methods, but he definitely agreed to the dangers of the so-called right opposition to the development of socialism in the Soviet Union. Sorry, what I was saying, just drawing on that, creating that context of what I was saying, the reason I was saying it is that I think it's generally agreed that the degree of stratification within the countryside in the Soviet Union prior to Stalin's collectivization was very minimal, and it was also minimal at the time of the October Revolution. So the presence of the kulak was greatly exaggerated. The idea that there was this large landowning class of kulaks, or powerful class of kulaks, that employed wage labor on a massive scale, and that there was kind of this mass landless proletariat in the countryside is a myth. Also, the term kulaks, has to be very carefully discussed, because the term kulak was used basically to anybody who was uncooperative with the Soviet state and was a peasant. Anyway. Instead, the state's resources were concentrated on the development of heavy industry. Quote, the procurement crisis of 1927 to 28 thus appears not at all the result of a, quote, inevitable economic crisis, but as an outcome of political mistakes. These were due to the feebleness of the party's roots in the countryside, and also to ideological reasons which led the party, even while recognizing that agriculture was the basis of economic development, to underestimate in practice the aid that should have been given to the peasant masses, and to concentrate nearly all its efforts on industry. End quote. Bettelheim. I wish that uh there was some more extensive literature, at least that I would be could be made aware of the influence of Bedeline on Paresh Chattopadhyay. Because Paresh Chattopadhyay basically a council communist. Um, all power to the Soviets would have been a good way to describe his politics. But I think that Chattopadhyay's critique of state capitalism or capitalism in the Soviet Union comes very much from Bedeline, and I think Bedeline, as opposed and along with Bordiga, um, made important. What was important for them was kind of like the internal nature of relations between production sites in the Soviet Union, whereas a lot of state capitalist theorists, and I think Tony Cliff would probably be like the biggest representative of this, at least to my understanding. I'm not an expert on Cliff thus far, but I'm pretty confident to make this determination, to say that Cliff uh, Cliff focused on kind of viewed the USSR as kind of like one big factory, um, and that it was capitalist in relation to the direct producers within the Soviet Union, but not internally capitalist in the sense of like competition existing between production sites, and um, kind of the law of value being operative within the Soviet state itself, but on whereas the Bordiga and Bedeline did think that, and I think that influenced Chattopadhyay a lot. So it seems like some of the what the weakness is. I mean, maybe I'm not sure what the rest of this article is going to say, but it seems like there's no reason why these insights of Bedeline necessarily result in kind of like Maoist conclusions. Um, anyway, back to the text. Already in the last years of the NEP, Bedeline argues stress was in practice being placed on the development of heavy industry at any price. The situation reflected the growing power of the quote state bourgeoisie, and in particular on the managers of large-scale enterprises. Um, Side note: if you'd like to have more information on this kind of like focus on industrial growth in the new economic policy period, check out the piece on this channel titled Lenin and I think it's titled Lenin and Taylor, um, on the practice of scientific management in the early Soviet Union. It's something like that, but it's by a guy named Rainer Traub, and it's very very interesting. And he kind of corroborates a lot of these like kind of premises. Um, this power was back to the text. This power was mirrored in various ways: the restoration of hierarchical labor management relations within the factories, a stress upon large-scale capital-intensive investment, and upon profitability, which led to a growing dependence upon technology imported from the capitalist West into large-scale urban unemployment. The persistence of commodity relations, the restoration of peace rates. But the quote Bolshevik ideological formation end quote also played its part. The growing quote economism of the Bolsheviks, with their stress upon the development of productive forces above all else, encouraged the party leadership, when confronted with the grain crisis of 1927 to 28, to formally abandon the policy which in practice they had already severely weakened. Again, check out the talk by Stephen A. Smith on social histories of revolution, which is was a very important lecture series done by Simon Pirani and Brendan McGeever in the UK, which kind of collected a lot of historians together to talk about the nature of revolutions in terms of how they reflect the activities and everyday lives of working people. But he says a very similar thing. He says in with Lenin, there's kind of there's definitely some pieces, particularly State and Revolution, which have a very kind of like utopian character, which kind of is kind of talks a lot about has a very anti-state, democratic, even libertarian kind of tone. But he says that that is true, and that Lenin may have been kind of swept up in this kind of moment of idealism, and what some might call like the carnival stage of revolution. But their ultimate belief was that what was necessary for the Soviet Union was the development of industry, or like what was necessary was the development of industry in the Soviet Union. And if that meant one man management, if that meant Taylorism, if that meant all kinds of other things that, from a direct production perspective, were very much viewed negatively by workers and the best of Bolsheviks, uh, so be it. Um, the idea of like, it seems to me very much so that the idea, like maybe capitalism, maybe not like the official doctrine of socialism in one country, um, might have been a special, term that was developed later. Uh, that was kind of used as a sort of defense of kind of uh, manipulating the Comintern to defending the social policies that were just favorable to the USSR as opposed to favorable to world revolution. But also it did kind of touch on a reality of like the extreme isolation of Russia. And the idea was that, at least in the theory of permanent revolution, which to some extent you could say like Lenin adopted, or at least according to Trotskyists, like Lenin adopted in the at least in practice in the October Revolution period in 1917. Their idea was that, okay, like the revolution, like the bourgeoisie could be overthrown, uh, and a worker state established in the Soviet Union in isolation from other worker states, but fundamentally the development of socialism in that state would be dependent upon linking up with revolutions that happened elsewhere, and those revolutions didn't happen elsewhere. And one of the things the revolutions elsewhere were supposed to do was to help in a cooperative way to industrialize Russia. And when that didn't come forward, uh, the the imperative to industrial, or like the desire, in addition to the imperative to industrialize Russia in isolation, became all the more pressing. Um, anyway, sorry, I'm talking too much. This power was mirrored in various ways: the restoration of hierarchical labor management relations within the factories, a stress upon large-scale capital-intensive investment, and upon profitability, which led to a growing dependence upon technology imported from the capitalist West into large-scale urban unemployment, the persistence of commodity relations, the restoration of peace rates. But the, quote, Bolshevik ideological formation, end quote, also played its part. The growing, quote, economism of the Bolsheviks, with their stress upon the development of the productive forces above all else, encouraged the party leadership, when confronted with the grain crisis of 1927 to 28, to formally abandon the policy which in practice they had already severely weakened. Bettelheim views the struggles within the Bolshevik Party during the 1920s through the prism of the Worker-Peasant Alliance. Quote, the Worker-Peasant Alliance was indeed the chief link at the time, the factor in which action had to be taken first and foremost in order to strengthen the dictatorship of the proletariat. The various oppositions which took shape within the party between 1924 and 1927 all overlooked or neglected this chief link, end quote. Again, whatever you'll say about Maoism, this seems very much to be the case. Um, the there never seems to be taken any into like in any account the conditions of the peasantry in the Soviet Union by the opposition. The various opposition groups, to my understanding, viewed the Soviet state as in some sense capitulating too much to the peasantry, which were put the state at risk for a bourgeois restoration, right? And it seems like this kind of like paranoia about the power of kulaks was something that was very much present in the left opposition, and is part and is the very hostile treatment of the peasantry by the Stalinist apparatus, um, you know, even if it might not have, the Trotskyists might not have taken that same course, definitely viewed this as a left zigzag. They viewed it as a left wing development. Um, there's definitely a certain like ambivalence about Stalinism on the part of the left opposition in terms of the policies it adopted in the late 1920s. Um, their focus is always on the working class. There's never very much said about the peasantry. Indeed, I would say this is kind of like there was never really that much of a pro peasant um, thrust within the Bolshevik Party, at least to my understanding. Maybe other people might disagree with this, but the people who would really put forward the necessity of the worker peasant alliance in some kind of like substantial sense um, were the socialist revolutionaries. They were kind of a peasant party, and I think their politics, I think a lot of their politics, like the Maximist left-wing strand of socialist revolutionary party, um, were represented in the demands of Kronstadt, like the free, in terms of like what they said about land, the free use of land by the peasantry as long as wage labor is not employed. Um, the idea of like uh, what was I gonna say? Yeah, I think that Bettelheim, in my opinion, Bettelheim is correct to say that the left opposition did neglect the worker peasant alliance, and I think that another person who would kind of feel this way would be John Eric Merritt, who wrote a very very insightful series of papers in a book called A Retrospective on the October Revolution or something like that. And he believes that the only democratic solution left to the Bolshevik Party in the late 1920s would not have been following the policy of Stalin or of Trotsky, but the only option to preserve the Smichka, on which uh, in which the democratic policy, some kind of democratic socialism could have been based, was the only solution. The preservation of the new economic policy in the conditions of isolation was the only hope to prevent something akin to Stalinism from occurring. So I don't know if this, and he's definitely coming from like, I think you say, I would definitely say that John Eric Merritt, he comes from, I think, like Brenner and like what's the journal that Brenner's affiliated with, Against the Current. He's definitely of the like democratic socialist, like kind of like, I think a lot of people in that milieu come from like Shachtmanism. I don't think exclusively, but a lot of them. And so like I don't think that the idea that the left opposition neglected the importance of the Smichka is really too controversial. But anyway, Trotsky and the left opposition are dealt with summarily. It's back to the text. Having shown that Trotsky, like Stalin, accepted the thesis of the primacy of the productive forces, Bettelheim repeats the usual Stalinist cant that Trotsky, quote, underestimated the peasantry, and argues that his program of speeded up industrialization would have led to the destruction of the worker-peasant alliance. Which is hilarious, because that's exactly what Stalinist practice did. Stalin, by contrast, gets rather different treatment, on the basis of a rather short-lived and managed, quote, self-criticism movement in the factories during 1928. Bettelheim depicts Stalin as a precursor of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. More generally, Bettelheim's favorite alternative to both Stalin and Trotsky is Mao. Quote, China's example shows that it is not necessary, and indeed that it is dangerous, to aspire to build first of all the material foundations of socialist society, putting off till later the transformation of social relations, which will thus be brought into conformity with more highly developed productive forces. China's example shows that socialist transformation of the superstructure must accompany the development of the productive forces, and that this transformation is a condition for truly socialist economic development. It shows, too, that when the transformations are carried out in this way, industrialization does not require, in contrast to what happened in the Soviet Union, the levying of tribute from the peasantry, a procedure which seriously threatens the alliance between the workers and peasants. End quote. Bedeline. This is really hilarious to me because the people who suffered the most under Mao's regime was definitely the peasantry. There was definitely a very much, I think, what's his name? Felix Wemhoyer, who wrote a book called The Social History of Mao's China, talks about this. It's like one of the main forms of stratification in Mao's China was between the Stalinist, not Stalinist, the urban areas where you had iron rice bowl protection and various kind of like what you might call social welfare state measures that protected the workers in places, like Beijing or other industrial centers, versus the kind of very precarious forms of living and the restriction of immigration from the countryside by the peasantry from the state. And if you're talking about just levying tribute from the peasantry, the degree of tribute that was levied from the peasantry in Mao's China was so extreme that somewhere between 20 to 40 million peasants starved to death in the era of the Great Leap Forward, which is why Mao was kicked upstairs and why he tried to initiate a revolution against the bureaucracy that he was a part of, to restore himself to power and ostensibly kick out the ideologically corrupt capitalist rotors, which viewed Mao's kind of frivolous, ultra-voluntarist relationship to development in the PRC as a very serious threat to the stability of the country and to the maybe less importantly, the welfare of the people it was under. Mao's regime, let's make no qualms about it. Mao's regime holds the record in the world for the state which killed the most of its people during wartime. During peacetime. The People's Republic of China was not at war during the Great Leap Forward. And still, somewhere between 20 and 40 million people, maybe you want to say between 15 and 35 million. Some people say as many as 50 million, depending on who you ask. I think the official figures of the Chinese state say 20 million. But the degree to which the peasantry was exploited under Mao is extreme. So that's kind of ridiculous. So just a very ridiculous idea that the Soviet Union exploited the peasantry and Mao's regime didn't. That's a laughing stock. Anyway, new section. Idealism and the productive forces. Let's leave China out of the discussion for the minute. Note the side which takes place within this passage from the, quote, transformation of social relations to, quote, the socialist transformation of the superstructure, end quote. Bedeline surreptitiously identifies the relations of production with their ideological and political conditions of existence. Yet Marx was careful to distinguish between the relations of production on the one hand and politics and ideology on the other, and to subordinate the latter to the former. Quote, in the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to any given stage in the development of their materialist forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness, end quote. And that's from Marx, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, which, as a side note, is where much of the mechanical interpretations of Marxism come from. The kind of like dogmatic assertions about the social ontology of society as such. It's mechanical in the sense that if you think of what something it means for something to be mechanical as opposed to organic, you're talking about something that is set in motion, right? Like a really mechanical, dogmatic interpretation of Marxism would be something that base causes superstructure, and the superstructure is in some sense epiphenomenal, meaning not causally determinate on the base, right? So the state really can't do anything to alter the economy, which is like a ridiculous assertion that no one in the world buys, and not even people who would reproduce, dogmatically assert what Marx says here. An organic relation would be a dialectical relation in which there's a reciprocal tension upon different moments of a whole, right? So, if you think of like an organic, like a body, right? Like it'd be weird to say that, like, I'm sure some people say it's like, oh yeah, like the nervous system is the precondition for blood, as if the circulation system, as if the circulation system wasn't concurrently a precondition for the nervous system, right? That's an organic kind of like understanding of how like a whole with different moments interacts with itself. A mechanical thing would be like, okay, so you have the nervous system, and the nervous system dictates the circulation system, and the circulation system can't have effects back onto the nervous system, right? There'll be a mechanical interpretation of the body, which is not an apt description or depiction of how parts relate to the whole. You might not be like, this is kind of a weird thing, and I think that it's very important, very important like countercheck to this kind of like dogmatic assertion of the base superstructure, which according to like one of the best Marxist historians, Ellen Makeson's Wood, is more of a hindrance than anything else, the notion of base superstructure. And that's kind of echoed by E.P. Thompson, where he's like, I find legal relations all the way down the social production process in all of my historical research. There's not like this like firm and fast distinction, and especially not one that's mechanically causal between, the relations in production or technology, even worse, and what the state does, right? They reciprocate with each other and dictate each other. There might be moments, right? Like if you have a really like if you have a capitalist economy, right? That's way the so-called economic base, which is like, you could say arguably like one of the main features of a capitalist society, is the separation between the like a sphere that you could call economic and the sphere you could call political. Um, but in that case, you could say that like, market pressures have way more of a dictation on the state, if that state is fundamentally committed and premised on the existence of private property and commodity production. You could say that like there was a very much a the causal relationship between the political and the economic was very strongly tilted toward the economic. But if you have something like Mao's China or the Soviet Union, for example, or any kind of like political project that tries to buck against market relations and private property, the political is going to become very, very much a primary thing, where they take the form of like some kind of like Stalinist or Maoist bureaucratic apparatus, or democratically accountable workers' councils. There's going to be very much a of the strong power of the so-called political to act upon the so-called economic. Um, um, Again, I can't emphasize enough, like trying, no, for me at least personally, in terms of like trying to get a good analysis of capitalism that gets away from kind of like the dogmatic burdens of the base superstructure metaphor. It's very much important to stop seeing like the economy as as like as this eternal thing that exists, that automatically dictates everything else that happens within that sphere, within the society as a whole, right? Obviously, I feel like what Marx and the materialist conception of history, or like the materialist analysis of society, tries to understand that like um, uh, is trying to get away from this idealist conception of society in which the state fundamentally dictates everything that happens, or like religion dictates everything that happens, kind of getting away from like a mechanical idealism, um, as opposed to and he doesn't want to replace. It seems like like at least like obviously we have here like this excerpt from the introduction to the critique of political economy, which the whole basis of like traditional Marxism is kind of like based on to a large extent. I think it had a very huge influence. Um, I think what this is replacing is like a materialist organicism, as opposed to a materialist uh, a mechanistic materialism. Um, but yeah, sorry, that was a long rant. No one gives a shit what I have to say. Elsewhere, Marx defines the relations of production in class societies as follows, quote, the specific economic form in which unpaid surplus labor is pumped out of direct producers determines the relationship of rulers and ruled as it grows directly out of production itself, and in turn reacts upon it as a determining element, dot, dot, dot. It is always the direct relationship of the owners of the conditions of production to the direct producers, a relation always naturally corresponding to a definite stage in the methods of labor, and thereby its social productivity, which reveals the innermost secret, the hidden basis of the entire social structure, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 3. And that, I feel like, is um, saying something much different than what is being said in this previous excerpt from a contribution to the critique of political economy from 1959. I feel like saying something like the heart of like the society is the relations of production in how like people um, interact with nature in their everyday lives, um, and interact with each other and interact with nature on the basis of their everyday lives is like the essence of society, is way more different than saying like you know making some grand causal claim about how um, uh, production, uh, automatically dictates um, the superstructure. But that's just my opinion. Alex Callinicos is saying something different, and maybe you're more sympathetic to what Callinicos is saying, um, but I'm not. And it says, back to the text, Bettelheim, however, systematically conflates relations of production with the superstructure, and especially, as we shall see, with ideology. Let us first consider the, quote, thesis of the primacy of the productive forces, end quote. Now, while what Marx writes on this subject is often ambiguous, it is fairly clear that he regarded the relations of production, the social relations between the direct producers and the owners of the means of production, as the motor of historical change. This can be seen in Capital Volume 1, where Marx shows in great detail that it was the emergence of capitalist relations of production which engendered the technological transformation of the labor process, which led to the mass industries today rather than vice versa. That's to me, that's absolutely correct, and it's a good point for Callinicos to point that out. The capitalist social relations creating the Industrial Revolution rather than vice versa. Anyway, for example, Marx argues that capitalism initially involved the exploitation of the workforce on the basis of a labor process based on handicraft production and inherited from pre-capitalist modes of production through the extension of the working day, the extraction of absolute surplus value. It was the shift to the production of relative surplus value, which involved the cheapening of labor power through increased productivity in wage good industries, which led to the Industrial Revolution. Quote, the production of absolute surplus value turns exclusively on the length of the working day, whereas the production of relative surplus value completely revolutionizes the technical process of labor and the groupings into which society is divided. End quote. Rejection of technological determinism does not, however, require us to adopt the opposite position and treat the productive forces as a mere effect of the relations of production. As Bettelheim argues, a given set of relations of production can only come into existence on the basis of a certain level of development of the productive forces. Capitalism could only develop if the productivity of agricultural labor were high enough to support an urban population of considerable size, if communications were sufficiently developed and secure to permit long-distance trade, and so on. It's important to note, and this is something I think that Brenner has a lot to offer, studying the Brenner debate a little bit, or at least reading Ellen Mason's Woods, The Origin of Capitalism, a longer view, which is available on this channel if you are interested. They fundamentally argue that the development of the productivity of agricultural labor was due to capitalism, right? So capitalism fundamentally must emerge in the countryside before you can say, before the mass development of an urban population of doubly free wage laborers. Anyway, similarly, and here the political significance of this argument should become clear, communism presupposes that the productive forces have reached a certain level of development. Crucially, it requires the existence of a world economy created through international capitalist competition. Marx and Engels insisted on this as early as 1845 when they argued that, quote, this, bracket, international, and bracket, development of the productive forces, ... is an absolutely necessary practical premise, parenthesis, of communism, and parenthesis, because without the development of the productive forces, want is merely made general, and with want the struggle for necessities would begin again, and all the filthy old business would necessarily be restored. End quote. Marx and Engels, The German Ideology. This passage is a remarkable anticipation of the evolution of the Soviet state after 1917. The failure of the European Revolution confined the new worker state to a backward country devastated by war, where a decimated working class was overwhelmed by a vast mass of petty bourgeois peasant producers. It's important to note, as a side note, and this is a point made by Rosa Luxemburg and by, what's his name? Why can't I think of his name? Shit. What's his name? He wrote the Theses on Bolshevism, and, God, now I have to look it up. Theses on, Helmut Wagner is who I'm thinking of. I want you to know that I thought of that before I even typed it up. But Helmut Wagner kind of makes this distinction, and this is one of the reasons why people sometimes will call, despite the massive participation, despite the subjective ambitions of the Bolshevik Party, maybe large portions of the working class, is that I think you can make some people might make the argument, and I think that like at least Helmut Wagner makes this argument. I don't know if Rosa Luxemburg didn't live long enough. She died in, I think, January 1919. So even among anarchists, the critique of Bolshevism wasn't particularly well developed yet. So what she would actually say on future developments is kind of a big question mark. Um, but at least Helmut Wagner would say that it was a bourgeois revolution, and the reason it was a bourgeois revolution was um, because of the edict of land to the peasants. For one, the peasants were taking the land anyway, and what they were probably going to do with that land, or must do with that land, as in the French Revolution, was kind of segregate it into, cut it up into different private plots. Now, you could say also that the presence of the Mur was still there, the old peasant commune, so that might have been a collective pressure. But generally speaking, what land to the peasantry meant to the peasants, whatever the Bolsheviks meant about national, like however they conceived of land to the peasants, which they basically meant nationalization, um, um, in order to preserve the approval of the peasantry, they had to grant and recognize the land that they took away from the landowners. Um, I think there's a quote from like the peasants when they're talking about grain requisitioning, that they like the Bolsheviks gave us land but took the food that we made on the land. Um, I think that there's uh the idea that like and this is something that Rosa Luxemburg also comments on, is that the land to the peasants is a fundamentally bourgeois claim, and not a socialist claim. Um, I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think there's probably ways you could say land to the peasants that would have a more socialistic in character, particularly say like the anarchist vision of collectivization in the Spanish Civil War, which was not based upon like distributing land to small private holders. Um, anyway, yeah, the idea that you know, I think there's a lot of like contempt in this description of petty bourgeois peasant producers. This term that Callinicos uses here, but it is accurate um, insofar as like um, uh, land to the peasants was not a socialist goal anyway. And that the peasants were and it sound has a sense of like the peasants were in some sense enemies, in a state where they constitute 80% of the population, and were in fact the direct producers in the country, not the proletariat. Um, the Bolshevik leaders are well aware of the dangers presented by their isolation from the rest of the world economy. It was in order to break out of this isolation that they launched the Communist International in 1919. Yet Bedeline completely ignores the international dimension of the Bolshevik Revolution. Over 1,100 pages, in over 1,100 pages, there is precisely one reference to the German Revolution, an astounding omission when one considers that both objectively and in the minds of the Bolshevik leaders, it was the failure of German communism between 1918 and 1923 which set the stage for the decision to build, quote, socialism in one country. Bedeline treats the class struggle in the USSR as a process hermetically sealed off from the rest of the world. The joy with which Lenin welcomed the overthrow of the Kaiser in November 1918, the eager participation with which the Bolshevik leaders, Stalin accepted, greeted the prospect of a German October in 1923, the internationalism of the, quote, Bolshevik ideological formation, end quote, are ignored. The theory of, quote, socialism in one country, devised by Stalin and Bukharin in the mid-1920s, is foisted onto Lenin, in spite of his constant repetition that, quote, we always staked our play on an international revolution, and this was unconditionally right, ... we always emphasize ... the fact that in one country it is impossible to accomplish such a work as a socialist revolution." End quote. Lenin. And that's from what? That's quoted in Tony Cliff's book State Capitalism in Russia. Bettelheim's separation of the forces and relations of production and his support for, quote, socialism in one country led Bettelheim to claim that communism can be built by an act of pure will, independent of whether or not its material conditions exist. In his discussion of the lead up to the, quote, Great Change of 1928, Bettelheim concentrates almost exclusively upon the failure of political will he sees as involved in the gradual undermining of the NEP. The line was wrong, not the material situation. For example, quote, the recourse to the criterion of profitability, ... reflected in the last analysis a certain situation in the class struggle and a certain state of class consciousness, end quote. Bettelheim. I feel like what I'm thinking about right now is like is like this idea of like will, and how will is one of those things that people kind of use in a very self-serving way, right? And I think that's very much like something that's common in the history of Leninism, is that there's kind of like this combination of like a pretty extreme voluntarism and a pretty extreme kind of like determinism. And determinism is always the factor which, when things don't go well or don't go into an emancipatory direction, and when things go into an emancipatory direction, it's always the it's always the so sorry, I feel like I fucked that sentence up that I was saying. Political will is always the attributing factor, the factor when things go well, and determinism is the factor when things go poorly or go in a non-emancipatory direction, right? So that's always the thing of like whether it be Isaac Deutsch or whoever, this is the Bolsheviks, they really exercised a lot of will in the October Revolution, and when things didn't pan out the way they were, it's just the political it's just like the material situation, right? And you can kind of think of this, in my opinion, it's just my opinion, whether this is, quote, Marxist or not, I don't really give a shit. But I think you can see, like, a lot of times is like people like to feel very proud of themselves and say they willed something into existence, when in fact it might be circumstance or something not quite so in their control. And then when things go bad, they're like, oh shit, my hands are tied, I can't do anything about it, or it's like, it's above me, right? I just can't help doing this thing. When I do good, it's of my own will. When I do bad, it's it's just the situation, right? And I think it's a very kind of like the concept of will and determinism, and like the material situation, this it's usually kind of like self-servingly applied. The Bolsheviks just couldn't have their just hands were tied. They had to like completely decimate the Kronstadt rebels. They had to brutally extract grain from the peasantry. They had to do this, that, and the other thing. But everything good they did was of their own will. That's just a side note from me, just a kind of like way that people sort of like talk about agency and determinism within the history of revolution. And it's especially interesting with the Bolsheviks too, who put so much of an emphasis on like leadership and so forth. To have such a blind faith and such a a faith in like organization and like party and like um kind of keeping spontaneity at a certain degree of arm's length, even if they're like are happy to capitalize on it um when they can. There's so much organization based. It's so odd to me that they would really have this idea of this like international revolution that was just around the corner, um when they did not know who would be leading these revolutions and who would be like who would what was the like the kind of like the Trotsky is kind of constantly says like, oh, the reason why revolution failed in Germany or here or the other place was the lack of the the subjective factor, which means like the party factor and like the wise leadership to kind of like channel the steam of the revolutionary energy into the appropriate piston. um I mean, I don't really know, but this is like the question that I would have is like, who do they think the Lenin is of France? Who do they think the Lenin is of England? Who do they think, I mean, obviously there's these big revolutionary spontaneous council movements in these places, but who do they think is like how much do they think any of these places are like have the kind of like leadership which they put such a premium on to execute something like October 1917. I mean, I'm just kind of like it seems like um kind of like I don't know, like it's one of the dogmas, right, of Leninism and Trotskyism in general. And Trotskyism, I would say I have more familiarity with than like a lot of the finer points of like orthodox communist theory. But like, yeah, this idea that like of like, if the like, did they not know that the cultural that the subjective conditions, that the absence of Leninist parties and Bolshevik parties that were distinct from the capitulationist social democratic parties, like, did they not have that like that awareness in general? Um like, did they think that Rosa Luxemburg was gonna suddenly, or like the independent social democrats were gonna like automatically carry out a revolution, or have the forces to do so? Like, I don't know. I'm just like, maybe that's just way more of a pessimistic thing, and maybe that makes me whatever. But I don't know. I'm like, um it seems like what would behoove someone, someone who had that power that the Bolsheviks had, to like seriously entertain the idea that like they might be left to rot in terms of like another another Bolshevik state popping up in some other corner of the world when there was no Bolshevik parties. Anyway, I don't know. Sorry, that's kind of I'm rambling a lot in this recording. But I feel like I need to ramble more because I need to become a writer and a thinker as opposed to just a reader. In building socialism in one country, in quotes, the Bolshevik leaders were free to choose between a continuation of the new economic policy advocated by Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky, and forced industrialization and collectivization, (the course ultimately adopted by Stalin), in parentheses. They made the wrong choice because they had the wrong ideas. Quote, the limits of the class, of the class struggle of the 1920s, and were set on the plane of social forces by the weakness of the Soviet proletariat. This weakness was not so much, quote, numerical as ideological. It was a matter of the slight extent to which the proletarian ideology had penetrated the masses, a circumstance itself connected with the poor development of socialist democracy. On the plane of theoretical ideology, it was connected with the absence of a rigorous analysis of the nature of the existing production relations and of the need to struggle to change them as to make decisive progress towards socialism. End quote. Bettelheim. Yet Bettelheim has no answer to the orthodox Stalinist rejoinder. the policy of, quote, industrialization at a snail's pace, end quote, rejection of capital-intensive high-technology investment, etc., which Bettelheim advocates, would have left the Soviet disarmed in the face of the growing danger of war with the Western imperialist powers. It was the pressure of military competition with the West which, in the final analysis, forced the rapid industrialization on the Soviet bureaucracy. Again, this is kind of like a, um, you know, the forced rapid industrialization, having nothing to do with Bolshevik ideology or like productivism or anything like that, but just strictly with the material circumstances. As if rapid industrialization was not a generalized wish of the Bolsheviks in general, despite the more cautious tones of Bukharin and so forth. Yeah, this is kind of like a key. This is like the linchpin right here of Cliffite understandings of state capitalism, in my opinion, is the idea of that like military competition, not necessarily economic competition, but military competition, which forced the USSR to become state capitalist, as opposed to any kind of like political conceptions or anything like that. Anyway, no doubt Bettelheim would have, in reply, stressed the virtues of Mao-style protracted People's War, but guerrillas alone would not have stopped the tanks of the Wehrmacht. If truth be told, they did not even free China of the Japanese. There was an alternative, even though Bettelheim's myopic stress on, quote, socialism in one country prevents him from grasping it. There was a number of moments in the interwar period when the structure of world capitalism was under heavy pressure. China 1925 to 27, Germany before 1923 and after 1929, France and Spain in 1936. If the Soviet state had placed the interests of the world revolution before its own short-term interests, then the isolation of the USSR might have been ended by revolution in the advanced industrial countries, but it did not. In the 1920s and 1930s, the presence of international revolution was championed by Trotsky and his the perspective of international revolution was championed by Trotsky and his followers, whom Bettelheim dismissed as, quote, economists and, quote, ultra-left. Ultra-left being a very stupid term that I hate so much. I fucking hate that. The term drives me insane. So on the one hand, you could say the ultra-left were like council communists. On the other hand, you could say ultra-left was like Stalin in, the in his so-called left zigzag, extreme left zigzag, which is like a joke to call Stalinist collectivization and basically primitive accumulation in the Soviet Union as ultra-left. It's fucking absurd. If you're actually concerned at all with the everyday lives of direct producers. It's ridiculous. But anyway, what is true is that Trotsky was very much a productivist. And I think that's kind of, and I think that kind of, he definitely viewed dearth, primarily, not any kind of political, he like automatically thought there was some kind of connection between industrialization and equality, and social and democracy, right? There was something like what caused Stalinism was fundamentally want. The famous thing that he attributes Stalinism to, just when there's plenty of bread in the bread store, people can come and take bread as they choose. But when there's a shortage, there's fighting, and there's a policeman that requires to mediate that fighting. And of course, the policeman has to feed himself before he polices this line. So he kind of has, access to, he kind of like grants himself a whole bunch of privileges above the people he's kind of managing. And because of this dearth, there automatically becomes this separate kind of like bureaucratic caste that oversees the generalized management of scarcity. and definitely views like has, if you look at, like, for instance, like just Trotsky's first, and this has been commented on by other Trotskyists. This isn't just like something from like Trotsky's critics, but like his like embarrassingly gloating um uh his glowing reviews of like the accomplishments of the Stalinist state in the first paragraph of The Revolution Betrayed is like fucking embarrassing. I mean, he goes on to qualify it to some extent, with talking about like massive waste and like the irrationality of production and kind of it like not really being planned, but also not really being market mediated either, and just causing all these kind of like drastic confusions and shitty products that are just kind of distributed through the economy. So shitty products are made out of shitty products and so forth. But his like evaluation of like what the Soviet Union had achieved after the new economic policy in the Stalin period is very, very much productivist in character. Maybe using the word economist kind of seems problematic, because economist kind of seems like a very confused kind of thing, where it's just like economists I usually associate, if I'm not wrong, with kind of like an exclusive focus on kind of like reformism and like bread and butter issues, like like increasing the minimum wage, increasing rates of unionization, increasing kind of like find it very much focused on what you might call in like the traditional Marxist language of like the minimal program. That seems very much to be what I associate with economism, as opposed to like you know other things that kind of really put a premise a premium on like overcoming capitalism, um, usually at least in the Leninist and social democratic sense, via the state. Um, they criticize the economists' lack of kind of like big picture thinking or something like that. But if you just switch out the word economist, which I think with productivist, which I think is what Bettelheim is alluding to, um, that's very much correct. Um, when it applies to Trotsky. I think that's pretty indisputable. Um, Now, obviously, um, that doesn't mean you have like the kind of like absolute idealism, which is kind of like not absolute idealism sounds way too I guess talking about a specific thing, but the kind of like ultra voluntarism of Maoism, which is kind of like its like charm, right? That's why people like it, because it's like just fucking like kick it till it breaks, and imperialism's a paper tiger, and like just just fucking do it. If there's the will, there's the way. That's why it's kind of like very appetizing to especially like young people who first get into radical politics, or people who feel like um, uh, things are moving too slowly. There's kind of like there is like a very much like let's fucking do it kind of thrust to Maoism. Um, which would be like, which I think is incorrect, but I don't think that I think the kind of dichotomy between kind of like deterministism or like productivism and kind of like this super um voluntarism is mistaken. And I would argue, whatever fucking Bettelheim has to say, or anyone else, Mao, I think, especially in the Great Leap Forward, the all idea was to like industrialize the fucking country on the basis of like you know an extreme exploitation of like the agricultural capacity of China, was very much productivist in scope as well, just as much as Trotsky, although entirely untethered from reality and extremely kind of like dogmatically ideological as well, with like extreme consequences for the cultural life of the PRC, which led to like a lot of violence, not just from like within the Cultural Revolution, but the repression of the Cultural Revolution as well. It's just like the idea that you just have like you know as opposed to analyzing the actual like concrete conditions of China, you say like, oh, the reason that China is having like is bureaucracy is not like the bureaucracy necessarily, but like the values of the bureaucracy. That's why the bureaucracy exists, because the bureaucracy is bad ideas, as opposed to the bureaucracy occupying kind of like a character mask of some kind, some that you might like say is comparable to like capitalists under more traditional capitalism. Um, yeah, like this. You know, I don't know necessarily what I'm saying here. If this is even like relevant to what Callinicos is saying, I'm just kind of like riffing. But like, um, there is definitely much. But I agree with the Callinicos is that there's definitely is like a fucking like um ideological, like an extreme ideologicalness of Maoism, which accompanies like a certain kind of authoritarian, intellectual, anti-intellectual populism, which is also probably another appeal for certain personality types within the radical left. Anyway, that I again don't think could be reduced to just sheer class position or whatever. Anyway, yet which is more unreal, a program predicated on the necessity of liberating the productive forces created by international capitalism, or Bedelim's apparent belief that imperialism would permit the Soviet state to build a disarmed, bucolic, quote, socialism in one country, end quote. I'm going to repeat that sentence because I feel like I said it weird. Yet which is more unreal, a program predicated on the necessity of liberating the productive forces created by international capitalism, or Bedelim's apparent belief that imperialism would have permitted the Soviet state to build a disarmed, bucolic, quote, socialism in one country. Uh, this is another weird sentence, too, right? It's like, um, because it seems like within the Soviet Union, whatever stripe you are, whether you're an internationalist in terms of foreign policy or you're a nationalist in terms of foreign policy, in terms of like what the Comintern does and how like it views it, whether it views like the Comintern as instrument of um, securing the Soviet state as opposed to producing or assisting international world revolution, whatever you think of that, whether you're don't believe or disbelieve in socialism in one country, I would definitely say that the general Bolshevik um, thrust was not liberating the productive forces in the Soviet Union, but creating the productive forces in the Soviet Union. Not taking capitalism, which is already preformed in the Soviet Union, and on the basis of that establishing socialism, but creating socialism from a country that was to a large extent, especially in the agricultural sphere, non-capitalist in nature. But those are just some thoughts. It's gonna be a terrible video because it's me just yakking so much, but um, yeah. New section: the quote state bourgeoisie and workers' power. For Bedelim, for Bedelim, it is, quote, the consciousness of men that determines their existence, end quote. This naturally leads him to concentrate upon ideological factors in his analysis of the Soviet state. Consider, for example, this passage, quote, the October Revolution was unlike all previous revolutions except the Paris Commune, by virtue of the fact that it was carried out through the guidance of proletarian ideas, end quote. Um, is that really disputable at all? Yet when Marx discusses the significance of the Paris Commune in the Civil War in France, Marx concentrated not on the ideas at work within the Paris Commune, but on the political structure of the Commune, the factors like the election of all officials and the arming of the people that placed it under the direct control of the working masses. The political tendencies influential within the Commune were far from being ideologically proletarian. On the contrary, they include all sorts of left Republicans and the followers of petty bourgeois socialists like Blanqui and Proudhon, against whom Marx had waged bitter war for many years. Similarly, in those writings, like the Letters from Afar, where Lenin analyzed the nature of the dual power produced by the revolution of February 1917, he did not argue that the Soviets were proletarian because of the ideas that guided them. It would have been surprising if he had, since the Soviets were then dominated by reformists and petty bourgeois populists of the Menshevik and SR stripe. Like Marx, Lenin concentrated on the Soviets' ability to serve as organs of workers' democracy and workers' power by virtue of the direct control exercised through them by the masses. Highly debatable claim. This theme informs the state and revolution. It is also present in the writings of Trotsky and Gramsci. This conception of working class power is central to Marxism. Workers' power is not the product of some act of will. Workers' power arises from the tendencies inherent in the capitalist relations of production, which drive workers collectively to organize themselves in defense of their interests. Those organs of struggle that unite the mass of workers at the point of production, the internal commissions of Italy 1918 to 1920, shop floor organizations in Britain today, represent working class power in embryo. This is like such a stupid because like the quote that he says that he's talking about from Bettelheim says the October Revolution was unlike all previous revolutions except the Paris Commune by virtue of the fact that it was carried out through the guidance of proletarian ideas, end quote. The October Revolution is not the Russian Revolution as a whole. The October Revolution was a military maneuver guided by a highly ideologized party. A party that had grand visions for political future of Russia. The idea, like I feel like Callinicos, and this is true of Trotskyists in general, view the October Revolution as in some sense some kind of like mass collective uprising where like the czar is just, the provisional government is just overthrown by the mass of the people, and that was fundamentally not what the October Revolution was. Whether or not the October Revolution and the ideas guiding it represented the masses, and whether the calls for all power to the Soviets were genuine, and that might be a different story. But it was definitely undertaken by a party, a highly politicized party that was thick with ideas about socialism and the nature of the current Russian Revolution. It was not just something that spontaneously popped up. This conflation with workers' power with the October Revolution is so fundamentally misguided. And when the workers of power, when workers' power was defended by the workers themselves, whether in strikes in Petrograd or in Kronstadt, what the Bolshevik state did was fundamentally repress those impulses. The idea that working class, like there's just no critique here of substitutionism at all. I'm really feeling myself in this piece right here. I'm like, God, this is so fucking stupid. The conception of working class power is central to, where am I? The transformation of these organs into Soviets, into a workers' government, is the result of the action of the workers themselves. The role of the Revolutionary Party is not to substitute itself for this process, but to make it a conscious one directed towards the seizure of state power. By who? That party. It was not by the workers' government themselves. It was definitely not by the Soviets. Bettelheim's fundamental error is to see working class power as a matter, not of the proletariat directly exercising power, but of the ideas inculcated into the masses by those who control the state machine. So Bettelheim writes, quote, "The Bolshevik Party was the party whose ideology, political line, style of leadership, capacity to develop the alliance between the working class and the peasantry, and consequently relations with the masses, constituted the ultimate guarantee of the proletarian character of the ruling power," end quote. Quote, "proletarian character," end quote, Bettelheim assures us, is nothing to do with the working class. Quote, "The working class members of a proletarian party may be relatively few, especially in a country where the working class itself is not large, without that circumstance damaging its proletarian character, which is determined by its ideology and a political line. End quote. Bedline. That last quote makes me feel a couple of different ways. For one, I disagree with this notion of like the proletarian party, whether it be actually have like a mass working class base being a matter of indifference, to whether the power that emerges from the actions of this party is proletarian in character. Like that I disagree with that. I also disagree, however, with I think of the certain kind of like workerist identity politics that is kind of like latent in like what I imagine to be the critique of this statement, right? The idea that what is important is like what is the class background of political actors in terms of like the meaning of what is happening, right? So for Marx, for instance, right, like you know, well, maybe I won't talk about Marx here, but like the idea of like, what makes something socialist is like the presence of workers. That's might be a necessary condition, but very, very far from a sufficient condition, right? Um, and I think that's like one of the merits of like this stuff that's kind of like maybe kind of like I don't really like it. I don't really agree with it, but some of like the value critique people, not value form analysis, but like value critique people like Robert Kurtz and Joppa and Ernst Lohoff and Norbert Trenkel and those kind of people that kind of try to like, question like kind of like the workerism of a lot of like traditional Marxism. One of the things I think that they think is interesting is like this critique, I don't know, of the idea of like something having like a lot of working class. I mean, maybe it's not, maybe it's misguided. Maybe I'm not spending it right. But you can also find this in like Bookchin as well. Like this kind of like idea of like, kind of like decentering like the working class is like inherently progressive, is very, very important, I think. Anyway, because you could if you said that like the Bolshevik Party was entirely constituted by workers, and not intellectuals or something like that. That doesn't rule out the possibility by any stretch of the imagination of it being substitutionist. If you institute like minority rule, and like the people who occupy that minority rule happen to have working class backgrounds, that doesn't make it non-substitutionist. Anyway, it follows that, quote, back to the text, it follows that, quote, in the historical conditions of 1918 to 23, preserving the proletarian character of party policy meant concentrating authority in the hands of those who embodied the historical experience and theory of the revolutionary movement, Russian and international. In other words, at the start of the period, in the hands of the political bureau and central committee, end quote. Bettelheim refuses to examine the conditions under which the party could continue to be part of the working class and not a substitute for it. The restoration of the Soviets as democratic organs of working class self-government, a regime of democratic centralism within the party, the extension of the revolution to the West, etc. The basis on which the Bolshevik leaders could remain in contact with the masses while their working class base decayed is a magical one. For example, Lenin's, quote, exceptional position, his ability to avoid the, quote, economist errors of the other Bolsheviks, is put down to purely personal qualities. Quote, his distinctive capacity for listening to the masses and the solidity of Lenin's theoretical training, end quote. The result is that the development of the Stalinist bureaucracy is seen as the gradual penetration of an increasingly autonomous state apparatus by the bourgeoisie and its ideas and practices. The implication is that the structure of the state machine and its material foundations are secondary factors, what counts as the ideology of those who run it. Because the Bolsheviks suffer from a tendency towards, quote, economism, they are unable to combat the growth of the, quote, state bourgeoisie, end quote. The isolation and backwardness of the Russian economy, the paralysis of the Soviets are irrelevant for Bedeline. I'm sorry, I'm kind of repeating myself again, but like, the Bolsheviks suffered from a tendency towards economism. They were unable to combat the growth of state bourgeoisie, saying that's Bedeline's position. Um, I feel like this is actually pretty apt. Um, the Bolsheviks definitely did put the primacy on development of the state of the development of the economy, and um if that necessitated clamping down on dissent, and if it necessitated one man management and the exclusion of other left wing parties from the political process, so be it. Um, that was definitely what was done. Um, and this is the problem with just like Trotskyist. I'm writing a thesis right now on Trotskyist conceptions of the USR in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and this is like, the problem of all of them is just kind of like this very romantic retelling of political events. I don't want to say revisionism because I don't know if they're necessarily revising anything, but just this kind of idea, like this complete, the fact that they operate within the Leninist tradition puts severe limitations upon the degree to which they can form a like substantial critique of the society that the Soviet Union would become. Um, the idea that like Leninism has nothing to do with Stalinism is far too simple. Whatever the like, I understand that like a lot of people of Leninism don't identify with Stalinism. That is true. Um, but the degree to which the politics of Bolshevism, the idea that the politics of Bolshevism have nothing to do with Stalinism, um, is ridiculous. I think that like the idea that like, I don't know, key people that were long term Bolsheviks supported Stalin, international and like within the party, um, is not something that like doesn't have like a precedent within Bolshevism itself. It's not like Bolshevism, I think that like Trotsky, whatever, people would, wouldn't want to say this, but like some of the best criticisms of Bolshevism from like a socialist perspective come from Trotsky before he became a Bolshevik. Like in the early, I think it was 1903, his like Our Political Tasks, I believe the piece is called, where he like makes a very like telling, um, he basically summarizes the course of events that did happen in the Soviet economy. I don't know if I want to say it's like prophecy or something, but he thought at that time that the politics of Leninism definitely had an authoritarian, anti-work, democratic, anti-working class content to them that would eventuate in the creation of one party. I mean, a small section of individuals ruling um, the party, and if the party had any success, the state that the party came to take power in, and eventually culminating in the dictatorship of one man. In that case, in 1903, it would have been Lenin, and Stalin was, um, an active Bolshevik at that point, but not like a main figure in the leadership. Um, this kind of just like thing that runs from, it's in Shachtman, it's in Burnham before he becomes an anti-socialist altogether. It's in it's in C.L.R. James, it's in Raya Dunayevskaya, just this kind of notion that like that there really was a thing that was the worker state, and then it degenerated into either remaining a worker state or becoming a non-worker state. It's very much there's no like substantial reevaluation of Leninism's role, the Leninist component of Stalinism. um, or the Leninist influence upon what became Stalinism. Um, yeah. Because the Bolsheviks suffered, back to the text, sorry. The result was that the development of the Stalinist bureaucracy is seen as a gradual penetration of an increasingly autonomous state apparatus by the bourgeoisie and its ideas and practices. The implication is that the structure of the state machine and its material foundations are secondary factors. What counts is the ideology of those who run it. Because the Bolsheviks suffered from a tendency towards, quote, economism, they were unable to combat the growth of the, quote, state bourgeoisie, the isolation and backwardness of the Russian economy, the paralysis of the Soviets are irrelevant for Bedeline. Bedeline's substitutionism is not tied to the specific conditions of Soviet Russia. Quote, the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat means that the proletariat sets itself up as the ruling class. And this cannot be done through organs of the Soviet type, which are mass organizations, or through state organs exclusively derived from the Soviets. The constitution of the proletariat as ruling class is necessarily effected through an apparatus that is specifically proletarian in ideology and aims, and in the role of the leadership and unification that it plays in relation to the masses. In other words, through a proletarian party that plays this role politically and ideologically, and plays it too in relation to the machinery of state issuing from the mass organizations. End quote. Bedeline. And obviously, I'm very opposed to this sentiment as well. I feel like when I'm reading this thing, I'm looking at two positions that I just disagree with. The idea from the substitutionism that is explicit in Bedeline and the substitutionism that is embedded in Callinicos' whole kind of theoretical schema of what the content, the social content of the Bolshevik Revolution was. And the early years of the Soviet Union, right? Bedeline is openly substitutionist. Callinicos is substitutionist through the back door. And it's important to note, the tradition. I think this isn't like a particularly I don't think this is particularly an innovative thing to say. But I think it's generally the case that you could say is like, whereas other Trotskyists who adopted a state capitalist thesis, in varying ways, moved into a more democratic form of organizing, a more like, whether more democratic or even libertarian in the case, like, so I don't know if I'd call like third camp Trotskyist or third campus like Hal Draper and Max Shachtman before he was moved into like a social democratic direction, or Julius Jacobson. I don't know if I'd necessarily call either of them like libertarians, but they're definitely their interpretation of Marxism is radical democratic. Indeed, Hal Draper calls Marx like a democratic extremist, and the way that they like oriented themselves politically reflected this kind of radical democratic vision. Whereas, to my understanding at least, the politics of the Socialist Workers' Party and the International Socialists did not necessarily kind of like take these critiques of Stalinism and let it fundamentally change their conception of how revolutionary socialist political organizations should orient themselves. Barring the state capitalist thesis, there's way more consistency between Cliffite state capitalist theory, Cliffite Trotskyism, and Orthodox Trotskyism than there is between what is conventionally called like third camp Trotskyism. And then you could say that, well, I'd say you could also say that at least the early Cliff was part of this third camp position, embracing neither Washington nor Moscow. But Cliff definitely kind of moves away from the third campus position as well as his party in general. Especially if you think of like, I think in like the 1980s, there's very much a significant sign within the Socialist Workers' Party that they've moved away from third campism. So adopting more and more anti-imperialist positions that you could call reactionary. There's a great book by Rossini Henson or Hensman. I can't remember whether it's Henson or Hensman. It's probably Henson. That sounds more right. That talks about the rhetoric of anti-imperialism. And what's interesting about that, I didn't reflect this on the time, or pick this up at the time because I wasn't as familiar with the history of Trotskyism. But she's critiquing this reactionary anti-imperialism in a group that was very much part of third camp socialism in the 50s and 60s. But eventually, by the 1980s, was supporting, Iran against Iraq because Iraq was, had at least some support. I'm not sure the exact details of it, but had support from the United States. So, because like Iran, despite being the reactionary, theocratic dictatorship that it is, getting the critical support of and how critical support usually just means support of the Socialist Workers' Party. There was definitely a decline in the third camp politics of Cliffite Trotskyism in the UK, and I think is kind of reflected in a lot of the politics of just like international socialists as a group, not like international socialists is kind of a generic term that's kind of means a specific type of organization that's kind of spread to the rest of to the rest of the people that are very heavily influenced by Cliff. And that's part of the reason, amongst other things, part of the main reasons for the existence of the group Alliance for Workers' Liberty, because it's neither part of they actually keep a consistent like radical democratic conception of socialism and a consistent third campus position. And that's why there's like that break. That's why I feel like, from my understanding, like that's the main thing that keeps that that like Alliance for Workers' Liberty in the UK exists, is because of this radically non-third camp, the decline of third campism and Cliffite Trotskyism. Like that seems like to be their main thing, because I know within like Alliance for Workers' Liberty there are people like Martin Thomas, who I have some pieces on his channel, who do believe that the USSR was state capitalist, whereas I believe that most of the people associated with Alliance for Workers' Liberty have a bureaucratic collectivist conception of the USSR. So whereas some people, I think maybe Donievskaya, to probably more so, but like people like Castoriadis and other people come to more cautious attitudes about the nature of early of the early USSR, but I don't think the Cliffite Trotskyists ever do. Anyway, sorry, that was kind of a long rambling rant. Back to the text so you can read this final paragraph. Bettelheim's recent protests against development in China since Mao's death do not alter the basic position. His idealist refusal to take into account the material conditions of the transition to communism leave Bettelheim disarmed in the face of the brutal realpolitik of Deng Xiaoping, for whom ideological struggle and industrialization at a snail's pace are a dangerous luxury in the shadow of Russian military power. The collapse of the elaborate charade of the, quote, Cultural Revolution, whose leaders have been hounded, jailed, and sometimes killed, while the Chinese masses look on passively or even enthusiastically, simply confirms the bankruptcy of Maoism and Maoism's Western spokespeople like Bedeline. Well, I agree with all that last sentiment. So, a lot. Alex Callinicos says some interesting shit. He says some dumb shit. I think his book Trotskyism is actually quite enlightening. If you ever read that, it's a pretty good history of the intellectual tenets of Trotskyism and some of the differences of opinion within it. I think it's very good. Um, Definitely think there's. I think um, these people are interesting and they had things to say, and I'm interested in their more of their critical analysis of other people than their own political vision, right? Um, and I suppose I could say that for all Trotskyists who had abandoned the degenerated worker state. I'm more interested in their critiques of the degenerated worker state than and the politics of Stalinism than in their alternative, if that makes sense. I'm interested mostly in their. I find mostly of some of their negative comments. I find their critique of the notion of the Stalinist USSR being a worker state very good. Whether necessarily I think bureaucratic collectivism or state capitalism in their particular Shachtmanist and Cliffist forms, I think that their critique of the degenerated worker state is interesting, and the critique of Orthodox Trotskyism being very interesting. But anyway, this is a little different than some of my other videos where I feel like lately I've just been kind of just reading them straight as opposed to just comments. But I feel like I really need to I feel this pretty strong need in my life to get more serious about having opinions about shit as opposed to just oh, this is what this person said and this is what this person said. But anyway, thank you so much for listening.